And I do want to welcome everyone to today's Lunch and Learn webinar, Native Controls in a Microsoft Dynamics NAV Environment, brought to you by ArcherPoint and Fastpath. Anyone familiar with the technical abilities of Microsoft Dynamics NAV will tell you how powerful this software truly is. Dynamics NAV goes far beyond the functionality of a traditional ERP. But even if you're a programmer, you might not be aware that there are certain native controls that can help you avoid having to buy an add-on to get the functionality you want. Today, we'll provide an overview of the native controls available in NAV and show you how to deploy them. Today's presenter is Nate Boucher, Director of Applications Development at Fastpath. Nate has 6 years of experience in software development, 4 of those in Microsoft Dynamics. In just under an hour today, you'll come away with an understanding of controls that will benefit finance, IT, and audit, including workflow, end-user security, administrative access, and other key features available in the latest releases. We will also offer a Q&A at the end of Nate's presentation. You can either type your questions in the questions pane of your GoToWebinar console as we go along, or use the raise your hand option to ask your question verbally during the Q&A. I will announce the person asking the question and unmute your line at that time. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Nate, over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Suzanne. As Suzanne mentioned, my name is Nate Boucher. I work at Fastpath as our Director of Application Development. I spend a lot of my time in the Dynamics space, more focused on the NAV and CRM products. As a general, Fastpath does go across all the Dynamics products, but I spend a lot of time in the NAV and CRM space, doing a lot of webinars and sessions at the conferences. In this space, as Fastpath as a company, we like to invest back into the user groups and all of the other areas where we can share our knowledge of the Dynamics products. So just to get started here, like Suzanne said, today's session is about native controls in Dynamics NAV. So we're going to go ahead and just look at the agenda here quick. We're going to go in just general introductions quick, and then we'll jump into the 6 areas that we're going to focus on today as far as native controls. This includes the security model, security reporting, administrative access, segregation of duties, audit trails, and workflow. So really the hope for today's session is so you can learn a little bit more about those 6 areas, how you can have those areas help you be compliant in your Dynamics NAV environment. You know, and in those 6 areas, are there native controls that exist? Are there not native controls that exist? How to use them if they are there. But if we get in some areas that there may not be a native control out of the box with NAV, then we'll talk about some more best practices and tips and tricks to help you around those different areas without there being something natively in Dynamics NAV. So those 6 areas are really the focus points when we're talking about compliance at Fastpath. So we'll go ahead and jump in here. So just again, a little bit about me, Director of Application Development. Most of my time is spent actually developing our software that integrates with all these Dynamics products. So spending a lot of time in how these the Dynamics products work and how they function is an important part of my job. So this one's a little more difficult to do. Usually, you know, in a scenario where I'm face-to-face with the audience, I get a little better idea. But just to give you some background, most of my presentation, you see screenshots, and most of the terminology I'll use will be from NAV 2013. But again, there's some nuances between different versions, and I'll try to point those out as long as we go. And I'm assuming we probably have a mixture of finance, IT, and audit in the room. So we'll try to tailor the conversation a little bit to each of those on the different areas as we go along. So the first item we're going to talk about is the security model in Dynamics NAV. I like to think of the security model, whether we're talking about NAV or any other product, it's kind of the root of everything else that we're going to talk about today. So when you talk about segregation of duties, you're going back and analyzing the security that you've assigned to your users. So I have an understanding of that security model. When you're looking at security reporting and you're saying, who has access in Dynamics NAV to maintain my vendors and maintain my customers? We're going to have to be able to provide some report around that, what you've assigned in your security model to those users. So really, your security model is the first step to being compliant in your Dynamics NAV environment and spending time to actually focus on your security model. When we talk about security model, we're talking about obviously your users that are part of your Dynamics NAV system. But again, then we go into the permission sets. I may also refer to them as roles. But these permission sets are going to be what you assign to your users. And then those permission sets are assigned permissions, so the actual permissions to the objects in Dynamics NAV. So that's the structure. We go from user to permission set to permission. And then on that permission, that's where we'll actually have the securable objects in Dynamics NAV. So the next slide will show you just a diagram of what we're talking about here, but the different objects in NAV, the one that will really kind of point out today will be the table data object. That's where you're actually going to have read, insert, modify, and delete permission to the actual data that's in your tables in Dynamics NAV. So the customer table, you're going to have read, insert, modify, delete permission on the data inside of that table. And that comes from the table data object and the permission that you assign. So within the table data object, we'll have the ability to read data, insert data, modify data, and delete data. So within each of those, you actually have, those are kind of what I call the access types. So one type is modify. And then the layer below that, what I like to call access levels. So basically for each of those permissions, you can have, yes, I have access to it, I have indirect access to it, or I do not have access to it. So you kind of have three choices: yes, no, indirect permission. So those are for each of those read, insert, modify, and delete, we can assign an access level: yes, no, or indirect. We'll get to indirect in a little bit just to kind of explain. I like to really dive into that a little bit. Some of my customers and our clients really have. That's kind of if they're new to NAV or they're new to analyzing security, that's often a touch point where there's a little bit of confusion. So we'll break that down in a couple slides here. For the rest of the object types, past table data, that's when we will have the only permission type that you can have on those objects are execute. So that'll go for your code units, your pages. If I have execute access, that means I can open that page, or I can execute that code unit. So there it'll just be execute will be the access type, and then the access level is either yes, I have access to execute, or no, I do not. So those are the different levels of the objects, secureable objects, and the different access types and access levels. One other thing I will point out here is what they call the basic permission set, or the all permission set in NAV 2009. In 2013, they called it the basic permission set. This basic permission set is going to give you access to what I like to refer to as basically the system table data objects. These are the objects that your users are going to need just so they can get into the application, navigate throughout the application, and do the system type of access. This won't actually be access to customers. The basic permission set's not going to have that. One example I like to use here is the change log. So Dynamics NAV has the change log for Audit Trails built into it. In order for, if you are using that change log, your users are going to need access to insert records into that change log entry table. And so that's one of the permissions that's included with the basic permission set. So you can kind of think of that as, that's kind of a system thing. If you have change log, my users aren't actually going in there and creating an entry. It all happens, behind the scenes in code, but my users still need access to actually insert into that table. So that's what the basic permission set's there for. And then this is also per company access. So you can set when you assign a permission set to a user, you can set a company that you want that access in, or you can leave it blank, which will mean all companies. That user has access to all companies for that permission set. I know a lot of our clients have multiple companies, so that per company access really breaks that down, where you can maybe do a little bit of segregation of duties and splitting what your users actually have access to do in the different companies. One other thing I'll point on here is user credential types. So you can actually have a couple different types of users. So the first one that probably a majority of our customers use is Windows authentication. So this is where your user is actually a Windows Active Directory user. So basically they don't have to enter any user ID or password when they launch the application. That's taken care of by Windows and Active Directory when they log on to their computer and authenticate to your Active Directory. That means they're a valid user. And so that's what's going to let them into Dynamics NAV. So that's a Windows authenticated user. You can also have a NAV authenticated user. This is in 2009. These are your database users that actually have SQL permissions. This is just a NAV user, so it doesn't tie back to Windows. You actually have a user ID and password in NAV that is managed. And then you can also have Windows groups. So Windows groups, this is going to allow you to create or set up an Active Directory Windows group as a user in Dynamics NAV and assign that Windows group permission sets. What that allows you to do is it allows you to simplify your security model and assigning security to your users, especially if you're a little bit of a larger organization where you have many users that have the same type of access. So you have an accounting clerk or an AP clerk or an AR clerk that maybe you say you have 5 or 6 of them that they have the exact same permissions in your organization. You could create a Windows group for that, assign those 5 or 6 folks to that Windows group, and then that's where you actually manage the security. So if you need to add a new permission to that role or a new role to that Windows group, all those users will get that new role. So it's a little bit easier to manage with a Windows group there. One thing I will point out here, one of those nuances between versions. If you're using NAV 2009, if you created a Windows group and you put a user in that Active Directory group, they could actually log into NAV without being created in NAV first. So they don't have to have any type of user record in NAV. As long as they have permission assigned from a group, they could get in. The change was in 2013. Now you actually have to have a user record before you can get into the application. Even if all your security is assigned from a Windows group and you don't have any security directly assigned to your user, you still have to have that user record created. So that will be one change going from 2009 to 2013. So that's a little bit about the security model in NAV. Just a couple other general items here that I'd like to talk about is when you can actually focus your time on security model. Implementations of, if you're implementing Dynamics NAV for the first time, or you're implementing a new version, or you're upgrading versions, those are great times to actually focus on security. Creating an actual project within your team saying, this is our project to focus on security. We need to look at who has, what should users have access to? How are we going to create our permission sets? How are we going to set up those roles? Who's going to get assigned to those different roles? So actually taking that into account. And one thing we like, that really helps our customers when they're trying to do this is actually kind of create a matrix. And so along the matrix on the left side will be all of the user types. So if you have an AR clerk type, basically your employee types. So that will be along the left side, and then across the top will be all the different areas in Dynamics NAV that you can secure. And then you'll kind of go through there and mark off which areas do this employee type need, which areas do this employee type need, and that's a general just way to start and to get an idea of what actually needs to go into my permission set. So starting with that matrix and analyzing what each employee type or user needs is a great place to start. And then don't forget it and set it. So you're always going to, one great thing about Dynamics NAV is how customizable it is and how easy it is to do that. But when you do that, you're creating new objects, you're creating new tables, you're creating new code units, you're creating new pages. So you got to have to remember that when you're doing those type of things to set security on those. You're going to have new employees. Anytime you get a new employee, you're going to make sure they are getting assigned the correct permissions, and you're not just giving them sysadmin because you want them to get, they show up on Monday and they're ready to work, and you don't have any permission assigned yet. So taking that security into the forefront of your thoughts And then new processes, if this is expanding or you're adding a module in NAV, that's going to be a new process that you're going to have to map. And this is the process that we're adding to NAV, and what areas, what objects are they touching, what tables is it touching, and where do I actually need to secure this process. So this slide is going to show us just a graphical view of kind of what I just laid out there. We start at the top either with your Windows user or your Windows group, or your user. It could be Windows, it could be the NAV authenticated user, or you start with your Windows group. As we take that, that's our top level. We assign the user and group permission sets, and then that permission set is made up of our securable objects. So you can see that first box there, the table data object. This is the one that's going to have those read, insert, modify, and delete permissions, access types to it. The rest of them you can see the only permission you can have is execute, yes or no. So that just gives you a little bit of, some maybe visual learners, a little bit of graphical look to the security model in Dynamics NAV. So the next spot we'll touch here is just some screenshots. These screenshots, again, were taken from one of our demo NAV 2013 environments. So this is just showing you when you actually, so I'm in the permission set called cost, as you can see on the title bar there. And this is actually showing you the permissions, the securable objects that are assigned to that permission set cost. So if we look at the first entry here, we can see there's a GL account table data object. Our user has yes read permission, or the permission set has yes read permission and has indirect modify permission. As we go down here, we can see for cost journal line, it has full yes permission to read, insert, modify, and delete. So that's actually how you're going to see that here. If you see a blank cell, that just means no. So they don't have yes access, so they don't have indirect, so they don't have any access to insert in the GL account or GL entry. So that's just a look at what the screen looks like when you actually set up those roles and create those permissions. The next one I'll point out here, this is that basic permission set that I showed, or I talked about earlier, and the table data objects. So you can see there's some table data objects that are assigned to the basic role and the permissions that they have on that basic role. And then one thing we'll point out here is these entries down here where you can see the object ID is 0. That's for object type of table, report, code unit, XML port, menu suite, page, and query. What that's actually telling me is when you see object ID of 0, that means every object inside of that type. So that means all tables, all reports, all code units. So you don't actually have to spell out each one. You can just use a 0 to say all of them. And then what happens is if we follow that over, if we look at code unit, for example, so for all code units in Dynamics NAV, I have execute permission. So when you take a look at this out of the box with this basic permission set, I have access to all the code units, all the pages, everything inside Dynamics NAV except table data and the system object type. So really where you're defining security and setting up security is really at the table data level. And so that's going to be where you want to focus in. Where you're actually going to assign permission is really at that table data object level. So we'll go ahead and jump here to the next slide. So this is our couple slides on indirect permission. So we saw on that last slide you could have yes access. We could also have indirect access. So how I like to describe indirect access or indirect permission is basically half of yes. So if I sign on my user, if my user has indirect permission to insert data, I only have half of the yes permission that I need to actually insert data. So if I only have indirect permission and I don't get the other half of my full yes permission from anywhere else, then I don't have access to insert into the table or insert that record into that table data object. So I always like to think of it as kind of a half yes permission as indirect permission. So my example that I'm using is I'm trying to post a sales order. When I post a sales order, one of the things that occurred was I deleted a sales line record. So this line that I highlighted here in the middle, I can see this user K Moore. On sales line, they have yes, they can read. They have indirect permission to insert. they have yes modify access, and they have indirect delete access. So by what that's telling me is when I go to post a sales order and I delete that sales line record, I'm actually pulling in this indirect permission. And so where you're actually going to get that the other half of your yes permission is from another object inside of NAV. So that's where you're going to bring in pages and code units. So you can actually assign permissions to a code unit. It's actually done out of the box. Assign permissions to code units, assign permissions to pages, and then that's where your other half comes from. So as you can select, we'll move on to the next page. We'll just remember that here we have only indirect access to delete to the sales line table. And if we look here, this is a screenshot of the code unit that runs when I post that sales order. So code unit 80 is the one that runs when I post that sales order. And if we look at the permissions that's assigned to that code unit, and I look at sales line here, I can see that this code unit has access to insert, modify, and delete records in the sales line. So that's the other half. I need this checkbox from some other object in an NAV to give me that full yes permission. So taking the indirect delete permission that I have to my assigned to my user through the roles, and taking the delete permission on the code unit, taking both of those together and putting them together gives me full yes access where I can delete a line in the sales line table, which then leads itself to a successful post of that sales order. So the demonstration that I like to do is actually taking away the permission from that code unit. So I'm going to take away the top screenshot here. You can see my sales line table. I took away those checkboxes for sales line. So I don't have insert, modify. The code unit doesn't have insert, modify, and delete access any longer to sales line. So I modified the actual permissions. So now I only have indirect permission to delete sales lines records from my user, from the roles that I'm assigning, and I'm not getting it through the code unit that I'm executing. So now I'm still left with just half of my yes, just my indirect. And when I go to try to post a sales order, I get an error. You do not have the following permission on table data sales line, delete. So I don't have that full yes permission, so you always got to think when you're doing indirect permission, we're putting two halves of yes permission together to get the full permission. So that kind of wraps up the security model. The different objects, how we can actually secure those different objects, the different access types and the different access levels, and indirect permission. So that gives us a good base of what we're going to continue to talk about in those 5 other areas. But the security model, again, really important that you start there, spend some time analyzing your security. One thing I will note, again, is since the conversation today is really aimed around what do you have out of the box in Dynamics NAV. You don't have to go buy other objects, or you don't have to write any custom code or anything. So that's really what the premise of today's webinar is about. So one of the things you can get with Dynamics NAV, and some of you on the call may have experience with this tool, you have to get the added to your license from your partner, but it is available to you, is a tool called Easy Security Lite. Easy Security Lite will actually allow you, when you're trying to analyze the difficult part is, I know I need to set up security, and I know I need to create these roles, and I know I need to assign these roles to my users to limit access, but folks have a hard time just deciding where do I start. So what you can do is you can actually, this Easy Security Lite tool actually provides a tracing mechanism where you can turn it on in, say, a development or test environment. You could have your employee, say your AR clerk, go through, and he or she can go through and do whatever they do in Dynamics NAV on a daily basis. So all those functions that they have to do in Dynamics NAV. And then what you can do is turn the trace on, have them do those items, and then turn the trace off. And then once you get done with that trace, you import it back into Easy Security Lite. It'll actually tell you what permissions were used during the process, and it'll actually give you the option to create a role or multiple roles from those permissions. So it'll actually generate the permission sets and the roles that you need with those permissions included. So that's a great place to start if you're having trouble identifying actually what people need access to. It's a great tool to start with. So the next thing we'll move on to is security reporting. So this is one of the areas that I mentioned at the beginning. There may not be a native function out of the box that provides you assistance with this. So When we're talking about security reporting, this is where we're actually going to say, one of the things, if you have an external, if you have external auditors come in, or maybe even your internal audit team, who has access to maintain vendors, who has access to create users, who has access to assign security. Some of those hot touch points that are common against most industries, really those master data, the setup changes, who has access to do those type of things. Right now, if you go in Dynamics NAV, you're not going to be able to go to one spot and say, hey, I need to know who has access to maintain vendors. So right now, no standard functionality. So what we're going to try to do is give you some tips around, what do I need to do for security reporting? What does that really mean to me? So as we said, no standard functionality, so you're left to create some manual reports. So really some of the key items, some key reports that you could throw together. And if you have someone that has pretty good technical knowledge and developer knowledge on Dynamics NAV environment or to the database, you could get down the road pretty far here. But basically creating a user to role access. So give me a listing of all my users and the roles that they're assigned and the companies they're assigned that role in. So that's a simple report, going to a couple tables in your database and running that report. Then the next one is actually going role to permission access. So now I have this role, AR clerk role or AP clerk role. What actual secureable objects do they have access to? What table data objects can they insert, modify, or delete to? So that's another report, and then taking that full circle and going from user down to permission. So going to user to permission in one report is a little bit difficult, but you could at least create these two reports, kind of match them up, use them for saying here are all the roles this user assigned, so they're getting all these permission sets or all these secureable objects in this second report. So those are a couple of reports that you could set up. Using SQL database queries, SQL reporting services. Again, if you have folks on your team that are more technically inclined as far as writing queries, knowing the database structure of the Dynamics NAV environment, you can get quite a ways using those tools to give you some quick reports around security reporting. So the biggest point, though, really is beyond actually writing those reports is having some process around security reporting. So taking really, and you're probably going to hear this a few more times today and you might be sick of it by the end of the presentation, but really taking a risk-based approach to your process as far as security reporting. So you may not need to know, really identifying in your environment, your company, what is important that I need to know who has access to in Dynamics NAV. So if you have a large inventory environment, so you're going to actually have to know who has access to all my inventory items. Whereas if you're just using for financials, who has access to, create purchase orders, sales orders, and those type of things. So really focusing on where's the high risk in your environment to know security, who has access to these items. So really, otherwise you're going to get into, if you're going to start and just say, I want to look at everything in my NAV environment, you're going to be blown away. Especially, if you have a customized environment where you have a bunch of more tables than you get out of the box, there's going to be a lot to analyze. So really taking a risk-based approach and then creating some process around it. The process really involves three questions. Who's reviewing my reports? How often are they reviewing them? And do I have sign-off that they actually reviewed it? So this comes back to really pushing it back to your managers, your business process owners, really getting the security reports in their hands because they're going to know of their employees base who should have access to what in their little department, right? If you give this to IT, well, sure, the manager told them to give Sally access to XYZ in Dynamics NAV, so they think it's fine, right? They're going to say, I gave this access, I was told to give this access, so to them, more than likely, everything's going to appear okay. So that's why we really try to emphasize, push it back into those owners' hands, the manager's hands. The next question is how often. Again, this could be a discussion between internal, external audit teams. Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Is it quarterly? It kind of depends on the report that you're running. It may be a quarterly report where you're just going to analyze what roles are assigned to what users in my department. So that's a quick, you only 4 times a year, just doing it quarterly, making sure everybody's assigned the roles that you suspect. And after that, actually getting sign-off. So having some evidence that your employees, your business process owners, your managers have actually reviewed these reports. They've made comments about them, things maybe that could change. So actually having evidence. So, what the great thing you can do, especially for those external auditors come in, is when they come in, you can say, this is my security report plan. So these are my reports that I review. This is who reviews them. This is how often. And then give them either, whether it's just a stack of papers that people have signed off on and printed them and signed off, or it's digital, giving them some evidence that here's the sign-off, here's the comments they made, here's the things that they have recommended to change or not change. So really building that process is just as important as the actual reports that you're going to be creating or running to look at that security report. So that kind of sums up security reporting. Again, unfortunately, no standard functionality, but there is the resources out there. And when we get to the end of the presentation, I'll have my contact information up on the slides. I'm more than open to helping out the NAV community. So, if maybe you just need help identifying a few tables that you could write a query against, or example, certainly that's something I could help out with. So the next thing we'll talk about is administrative access. When we talk administrative access, this is going to be one of the biggest red flags to an auditor. Who has access to the super role? Who has access to do whatever they want in the system? So that's one of the common pitfalls we see with our customers is, we're implementing Dynamics NAV, it's great, it's going to be awesome, it does all these things for us, so we're upgrading, we can't wait to get to 2015, but we forgot to do security, we forgot to analyze security, and now people just have super access so they can do their job, right? That's where we have issues. That's where we have, those areas that are going to be exposed that shouldn't be exposed, getting data into the hands of people that shouldn't have it, giving them too much access. So out of the box with the Dynamics NAV, there's a super role and there's a super data role. Super has access, yes access to every single object in the system. Even if you're going and creating custom objects, the way the role is set up, it's always going to have yes access to every object. You don't have to actually go and add it. Every object, it uses that object ID of 0, so every object in the system it'll have full yes access to. And then super data, this role is going to give the difference there between the two roles. Super data will give you full yes access, or full yes read, insert, modify, and delete access on all the table data objects. So it has full access to change any type of data in the Dynamics NAV environment. So those are what are provided out of the box. If you're implementing for the first time, the first user is created as a super user. But a couple items here, like I said, the super role is not programmatic, so it's actually, there's not some code in the system where it's saying, if user equals super, bypass security. It's actually a role, so you go in and you actually pull up a permission set called super. It's actually assigned permissions. But when we look at the next, I'll give a screenshot on the next screen, it's actually using that object ID of 0. So that's where you have all objects in that object type, they have yes access to. One of the things that I'd like to point out here is the recommendation of a super read role. I got this from one other colleague that I work with quite a bit in the Dynamics NAV community. But the super read role, basically we could create that role called super read and just give it yes access, yes read access on every single table data object. So that's the only thing that's on that role. What this allows you to do is if you have some higher level folks in your environment, CFOs, CIOs, CEOs that want to be able to run reports or go in and look data, or managers that may need to do the same thing, that gives them the access to actually read the data. So the difference there becomes is when you actually give that insert, modify, and delete access, that's actually changing data. So that's going to get into the segregation of duties. How am I splitting out that insert, modify, and delete access? But when we're talking about read, there may be some other regulations, HIPAA regulations if you have sensitive data in there that you'll have to think about. But at least super read gets you down the road where people aren't getting errors because they don't have access to read the data. So that's one recommendation that we like to make. Totally up to your environment, but it's one good one instead of using that super rule or the super data rule to actually create that super read rule. So here's a screenshot. This is the super role permission. So as you can see in my menu bar here, super, all object types. So here's all the object types in Dynamics NAV. Object ID is 0. That's telling me I have all objects inside that object type. So all table data objects, I have yes read, yes insert, yes modify, yes delete. And for the rest of these, the other ones that we have execute, we can see we have yes execute. So inherently, you have access to everything inside the entire system. Super data, this is where you actually just have full access to the table data object. So we can see the only line in this screenshot here is the table data object. Object ID of 0, and yes read, yes insert, yes modify, and yes delete. So full access on the table data object. Next item here, this is that super read role that I've talked about that you could create. Again, this is not out of the box, but something you could easily create. Basically there again, object ID of 0. I have every object in the table data object type, and the only thing I have is the yes read. So I only have access to look at data, read data, so I don't have to run into permission errors as far as retrieving data. So that kind of wraps up administrative access. Again, really try to avoid having users assigned to it. One of the key things there is, at least having a report that you can run to say who has that. Give me all my users that are assigned super. That's going to be a hot report for an auditor. And then actually having that report, and then even better than having the report is having a justification or a reason why that's assigned. If you don't have any justification, it's just they need access to do their job. That's not going to fly with auditors. So actually having some justification around why that super role is being used. So the next item we'll talk about, control area that we'll talk about is segregation of duties. So this kind of goes back like security reporting. Unfortunately, there's no standard functionality out of the box to assist you with segregation of duties in your Dynamics NAV environment. So when we talk about segregation of duties, it really comes out of the SOX regulations, especially for public companies. We have a lot of clients that are actually privately held that still have they're not specifically under that SOX regulation, but they still have a strong internal audit team that really focuses on creating these segregation of duties, making sure people have the right amount of access inside your ERP system. So with no standard functionality around segregation of duties, really is just some best practices here of having a methodology to follow. So there's kind of two methodologies that you go around. Preventative and detective are two common ones. When you're talking about preventative controls for segregation of duties, that's where you're actually going to have code or objects inside of Dynamics NAV that's going to stop somebody from doing something because it's a segregation of duty conflict. Creating a vendor and then cutting a check to that vendor. So that's an easy example, and so the preventative side, very hard to program and get it right, but that's actually stopping people from doing something. Whereas if you go the detective route, this is where you're actually going to do more, obviously not preventing them from doing something, trying to detect what risks I have. You're running reports and analyzing, and so really what you're thinking about there when you're talking about detective controls is running, analyzing all my security that I've assigned in my NAV environment to all my users, and then running that against a rule set. And so the rule set is really going to identify the conflicts in your system. And so that's actually the biggest piece, is actually building that conflict rule set. Say, if I have access to this table data object and this table data object, that's a conflict. And so when we talk about conflicts, again, we're going back to just having that above read access. So having insert, modify, or delete access to that table data object. And so since we're, as we talked before, securing Dynamics NAV at the table data object, since you have full yes access to code units and pages, and we're really securing down the table data objects, that's where we're going to analyze segregation of duties. So there's an ISACA rule set. Again, my contact information is at the end, so you can also email me about this. But ISACA has a just general rule set. Obviously, it's not specific. You're not going to go in there and see NAV terminology, but it's very generic, and it's going to give you a great place to start where you can actually start identifying those conflicts. But after that, after you have a detective, preventative methodology to follow, building your rule set, having your security assigned. So those are a couple of the first steps. You can tell segregation of duties is kind of a bear to achieve. But after that is actually building some solution. So whether you're going to build an automated solution, you're doing some manual transaction sampling, building some solution to actually analyze those, right? So a manual transaction sampling, so our conflict here is maintaining vendors and posting purchase orders. So that's a conflict from our rule set. And we're going to do some manual transaction sampling. So what we're going to have to do is actually have an audit record of all the vendor changes, what users are making all my vendor changes. And then what are all my users making purchase order changes. So creating purchase orders, posting them, having those different levels of access, and actually doing some transaction sampling. Because really, if we're thinking about segregating out those two items, you should not have a user that's doing both of those items. Otherwise, that would constitute a segregation of duties conflict. So that'll get you to manual, using some manual process to actually do some transaction sampling. Again, there's going to be a lot of data to churn through, especially if you're a larger organization and you do a lot of purchase orders, or you have a lot of vendors you maintain. There's going to be a lot of sampling or a lot of transactions you have to look through. So again, it's a little more effort involved there to do that manual, but to build an automated solution from ground up is going to be very difficult. A lot of hours involved there. So most clients I see, if they're going to try to do this themselves, go the manual route, do some transaction sampling, really identify what are those high-risk areas, take that risk-based approach, creating that rule set, getting two items across from each other, identifying that conflict, and then do some transaction sampling around those. So with that transaction sampling, that means we're going to have some type of audit trail to be able to track who's doing what inside my system. But when we're talking about that, if we actually do that transaction sampling, somebody's created a vendor, someone's created a purchase order for that vendor, that would flag as a segregation of duties risk conflict. But the item there to not forget about is you may be such a small, medium-sized organization where you just can't get around that. You only have so many employees, and they only know how to do so many things in Dynamics NAV, and they may cross, right? So you may have that conflict. And really, more than likely, if you had a full-fledged segregation of duties tool that analyzed everything in your system, there's really, it's nearly impossible to get down to no conflicts, no segregation duties conflicts. That's really not the goal. You're probably going to have some overlap somewhere, but actually analyzing that and be able to identify that is the important part. And then we talk about process controls. So process controls are, okay, so I know I have an issue with someone creating vendors and creating purchase orders. But I have a process control where I have to get my purchase order approved before it can post. So I'm having a secondary source overlooking me, everything that I'm doing around my purchase orders, and that would be a process control. So really, segregation of duties really comes down to balancing your process controls and your system security. So setting up your system security so you really reduce the amount of segregation of duty conflicts that you have. But then with the ones that are left over, then you really try to build in process controls to mitigate those. So you're going to mitigate your conflicts with your process controls. So it's a very involved control to try to achieve, especially since there's nothing out of the box with Dynamics NAV to help you with this. But hopefully with that little bit there, that'll help you give an idea of maybe some things you can do in your environment if you're already not doing something around segregation of duties. The last point I'll touch on is just kind of a repeat from security reporting, building a repeatable process to analyze those conflicts and where you may have risk, but then also having reviews of those, right? So who's reviewing those manual transaction samplings? How often are you doing it? Building that process, getting a sign-off, getting comments saying, we noticed Joe's did both of these items, creating a risk, but we have a process control XYZ. So again, building that repeatable process where you can actually have something that you repeat on a fairly frequent basis, having a review process around the reports as well. The next item we'll go in and talk about, the next control area will be audit trails. So luckily in this area, there is something that Dynamics NAV does provide out of the box, and that's Dynamics NAV changelog. We touched on this a little bit earlier, and then on the last slide when we were talking about segregation of duties, if you're going to do that manual transaction sampling, you're going to have some type of audit trail to track the users that are making your changes. So you can use the Dynamics NAV changelog. The changelog, again, out of the box, and basically what you're going to have to do is actually, per company, you're going to go in and activate the changelog. So you first have to go to the activation window, say, I want to turn on the changelog for this company. You have to do it for each company that you want to turn changes on for. After you've done that, then you actually have to specify what table and fields in my Dynamics NAV database do I want to track. So this will go back to all the table data objects that we've assigned security to. It'll be the same table data objects that you can select that you want to track changes for. So customer table, vendor table, user table, permission set table. Those are just some areas where I'm going to track all of my changes to my customers. And what you can do is actually once you specify you want to track that table, you can either choose all fields on that table you want to track or just certain fields. Again, taking a risk-based approach. What are the critical tables that I need to know changes for and have an audit trail log for? And then taking it a step further, going into that table, so the customer table, the vendor table, what fields in that table are important for me to know that changed and I have a change log for, right? So there may be a fax number or some other column in there, some other field that you don't really care if it changes. But if we're talking about the remit to address where you're going to cut the check, that may be important. So those are the type of decisions that you're going to have to make as an organization, is really sitting down, taking a risk-based approach, what are my critical tables, and even taking a step further, what are my critical fields in that table to track. And that'll be really the biggest part of setting up your audit trails, is actually making those decisions, analyzing all the tables, and making those decisions on what you're going to track. One of the things we also like to say is if you're not going to review the audit trail log record for those things that you've turned on, don't turn them on. Because with any audit trail, there's obviously going to be additional processing that goes into it, additional data storage that goes into it, so there's going to be some performance consideration. So if you turn on, every transaction, if you turn it on, customers, every time you touch a customer, create it, insert it, modify or delete a customer record, we're going to validate, the Dynamics NAV is going to validate, am I supposed to track this table? Am I supposed to track this field that's changing? And then if so, it'll write a changelog entry. So there is some consideration there to really reduce the performance impact, is to really decide what's high risk. So that's going to be important. Again, if you're not going to review it, don't track it. The other thing I'll mention here on the changelog, it's only going to track changes inside of Dynamics NAV. Inherently, if you're going in NAV and creating a customer, it's going to track that, right? But if you have someone that's trying to, they have elevated SQL permissions, whether it's by mistake or on purpose, they go in and try to change data in the actual database, that actually won't get tracked because it's not happening inside the application. Or if you have some third-party application that somehow cooks to the database and messes with the data, that's not going to get tracked either. So we have to remember it's only going to track changes inside the NAV client. When we're talking about Dynamics NAV 2013 and greater, that's where they introduced the NAV service account. That service account is actually going to be the one connecting to the database. So that's if you're tracking, if you're looking at changes at the actual SQL level, at the database level, those changes would come across as the NAV service account. Whereas before in NAV 2009 and prior, you actually had those SQL users that they were the ones connecting to the database. Whereas now in 2013 and beyond, we have that NAV service account that will actually be connecting to SQL and making those changes. Like I said, if you're not going to report on it, don't track it. So we're actually getting to the reporting, right? So we've turned on tracking, we activated the changelog, set up our tables and fields. Now what do we do, right? So there's if you go into the changelog entry, basically you can open the changelog entry page. I'll have a screenshot of this next, I think. But actually reporting on that audit trail data. So pulling in, going into each company, pulling the changelog entries, having somebody review those. And again, building that repeatable process, right? So having someone that's designated to review all the customer changes on a frequency, right? Every week, every month, and then actually having sign off on it. This user reviewed all my customer changes, all my vendor changes, all my user changes. So building that repeatable process where we actually have some process set out. Again, who did it, who's doing the reviews, how often are they doing those reviews, and is there sign-off that they're getting done? So we'll go ahead and I'll just show you a couple screenshots here. This is the left window here. This is where you actually go in and actually turn on the changelog. So you actually go in and activate it. The option here or the window to the right, this is where you're actually setting up the changelog. So you can see for the customer table, I've turned on for insert, modify, and delete. I've turned on tracking in all fields. And then if you see under here on vendor, I've selected some fields for insert, modify, and deletes. So that's where you can see the difference between all fields or some fields. If you selected on some fields here, there's a little pop-up that you would get, and that's where you would actually go and insert, what fields on this table do I need to track. So you can really get down to the field level of what's important to you. The next slide here is going to be the changelog entries that I talked about. So we're just going to the changelog entry page. This is giving you just a listing of, so it looks like we went in and changed some customer records. This will actually give you the field that was changed. It'll give you the old value and the new value. So it looks like I changed the address I modified, this is the actual event, whether it was an insert, modify, or delete. I modified the address for this customer from Chicago to Waukee, Iowa. So that was a change that was occurred. Primary key field value, so this is actually the primary key, the record ID for that customer. So that's actually going to be your identifier there of what actually record did change. And then these are the field level changes that occurred for that record. So that's actually reviewing those audit trail changes. So that kind of sums up audit trail here. So I'll now jump into my last slide here as far as, or my last section of controls here. The last one we'll talk about is workflow. Workflow is when I like to think about it, is basically a process control to one of my segregation of duties conflicts, right? So we gave the example of creating vendors or maintaining vendors and the purchase orders. So a workflow is you could use Dynamics NAV workflow and what they call them is document approvals. And basically you can get approvals for sales or purchase orders. So a mitigation to that conflict I was getting for SOD, segregation of duties, would be implement Dynamics NAV workflow for purchase orders. So you can go and turn this on, and you can go and actually set up approval managers and approval amount limits. So anything above 10,000, then I need to get approved by this manager. Anything above 100,000, I need to get approved by this manager. So you can actually set up that hierarchy of who's actually going to be responsible for reviewing these purchase order and sales orders. So it's just basically a workflow approval process to get a second set of eyes on what you're doing inside your system, creating that process control. You can have basically there's an approval administrator that maintains the system, so they set up that hierarchy. Also set up substitute approvers, so if your manager's in Hawaii on vacation for 2 weeks, you don't have to go 2 weeks without getting a purchase order approved. You can set up substitute approvers to get those approved, so you can continue doing business. And then there's notification built in. So anytime if someone submits a purchase order for approval, the approver will get a notification email saying you're required to look at this. We'll also look at overdue approval. So you can set up how long, what overdue means to you, 3 days, 5 days. You can set up that, and then if that purchase order is still sitting out there for approval after that overdue period, then we can notify the approver again. So there's built-in notifications. So again, this is it's another tool built in natively into Dynamics NAV that can help you with your system, putting in those process controls, helping you be compliant. So here's just an example. This is the approval user setup, where you can set the sales amount of approvals, you can set a purchase amount of approvals, so really setting that. You can see here's the substitute approver, so you can really see the values there that are set up. So that leaves me with, looks like about 4 minutes until 2 o'clock here, so I just appreciate everybody joining us today. Again, you can see my contact information. You can see the presentation obviously brought to you by ArcherPoint and Fastpath. ArcherPoint's information is there as well. Feel free to reach out to me with anything I talked about today. You know, a couple of those items I said I could help out with, certainly. So if you jotted that down, send me an email and I'll be happy to help you. But I guess we can, Suzanne, we can open up to any questions that may be out there if there is any.
Yeah, I don't have anything in the questions pane right now. If you do have any questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in anyway. Well, we do have a few minutes left. While our audience is doing that, I just want to go ahead and thank everybody for their time, and we hope you consider it time well spent. To help us to continue to offer value, we'd like to ask that you take a few minutes more to give us your feedback and suggest other topics for future Lunch and Learn webinars. You can send those to info@archerpoint.com. Again, thanks everybody for your time. I'm going to stop the recording now and take questions.